Here's something most people never find out about themselves. Right now, tonight, somewhere between 80 and 90% of human beings on Earth have had thoughts that they would be deeply ashamed to say out loud. Thoughts about harm, about contamination, about doing something terrible. Thoughts that arrived without warning, completely uninvited, and made the person who had them wonder, even for a fleeting moment. What does it mean that I just thought that? The difference between you and someone with OCD is not the thought itself. The thoughts are almost exactly the same. The difference is what happens next. For most people, the thought drifts through and disappears. The mind files it under noise and moves on. But for someone with OCD, that thought catches on something, a hook deep inside the mind, and it will not let go. It comes back. It escalates. It demands a response. And the person is left in a loop they did not choose, cannot simply stop, and often cannot explain to us. Anyone around them. That is what we are exploring tonight. Not the punchline version, not the neat desk jokes or the television characters who cannot tolerate a crooked picture frame. The real thing. The thing that costs people years of their lives, that hides behind enormous shame, and that is one of the most consistently misunderstood conditions in all of mental health. Let's go gently into it. Slowly, carefully. By the end of tonight, you will understand OCD differently than most people ever do. And that understanding alone has the power to change something. We need to start with a statistic. It is the kind of number that sounds impossible until you understand what it actually means. On average, a person with OCD will wait somewhere between 11 and 17 years between the onset of their symptoms and receiving appropriate treatment. That range comes from multiple studies spanning several decades. A 1997 survey of over 700 members of the Obsessive Compulsive Foundation found an average delay of 17.2 years, while more recent research from 2021, analyzing 100 adults in an OCD outpatient setting, found an average diagnostic delay of around 12 to 13 years. Numbers have improved somewhat with increased awareness, but in any version of this story, the gap is staggering, a decade or more, of suffering, mostly in silence, of being told it's just anxiety, just stress, just overthinking, of not having a name for what is happening. And one of the biggest reasons for that silence is something that should feel absurd, but is entirely real. It is the phrase, "I'm so OCD." This expression has become so embedded in casual conversation that it now functions almost as a personality descriptor. Tidy person, OCD, punctual, OCD, color-coordinated closet. Oh, you know me, I'm a little OCD about it. It is used affectionately, often as a compliment, completely detached from what OCD actually is. Here's the consequence. When someone living with genuine OCD hears that phrase, they encounter a description of a condition that looks nothing like what they are experiencing. They think, the thing I have doesn't match what people call OCD. Therefore, maybe I don't have OCD. Maybe I'm just broken in some other unnamed way. It pushes them further into hiding. It deepens the shame, and it buys another month, another year, another chapter of life spent inside the loop without a map. The trivialization of OCD in popular culture is not a minor inconvenience. It is, in a very real sense, a barrier to treatment for millions of people. So let us spend this time replacing the shorthand with the actual science. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 5th edition, the DSM-5, defines OCD by the presence of obsessions, compulsions, or both. These are not casual words. Let's unpack them carefully. An obsession is an intrusive, unwanted thought, image, or urge that enters consciousness repeatedly and generates significant distress. The experience is ego-dystonic, a clinical term meaning the thought feels foreign, contrary to the person's values, and inconsistent with who they understand themselves to be. This is critical. the obsessive thought is not a desire. It does not reflect character. It arrives like an intruder, and it causes distress precisely because the person finds it so alien and disturbing. A compulsion is a repetitive behavior or mental act performed in response to an obsession, aimed at reducing distress or preventing a feared outcome. And here is where the cruelty of OCD reveals itself most clearly. The relief from a compulsion is always temporary. Always. And the performance of the compulsion actually reinforces the loop. It teaches the brain that the obsession was a genuine threat worth responding to, making the thought more likely to return, more urgently, sooner. This is the OCD cycle. An intrusive thought arrives. Anxiety spikes. A compulsion is performed. Temporary relief. The thought returns, often stronger than before. One important correction to a popular misconception: compulsions are not always visible. Many people with OCD perform what are called mental compulsions, internal acts of reviewing, reassuring, analyzing, or mentally neutralizing a thought that are entirely invisible from the outside. The image of someone washing their hands or checking a door lock is only one piece of a much larger picture. The DSM-5 specifies that obsessions or compulsions must be time-consuming, more than 1 hour per day, and must cause clinically significant distress or functional impairment. For many people with OCD, the time spent is far more than 1 hour. Some describe losing entire days, entire seasons. The World Health Organization, in landmark assessments of global disease burden, has listed OCD among the leading causes of disability worldwide when measured by lost income and quality of life, ranking it alongside conditions like depression and schizophrenia, conditions that rarely become punchlines. Here is one of the quietest and most revealing things about OCD. It is ancient, not in the sense of being well understood, quite the opposite. But the experience it describes has been recorded, named in different ways, and suffered through for as long as human beings have been writing things down. The earliest documented presentations that historians of psychiatry believe align with OCD come from medieval religious accounts of a phenomenon called scrupulosity, an anguished, uncontrollable preoccupation with sin, moral failure, and spiritual purity. Individuals described being unable to stop confessing, compelled to repeat prayers endlessly, tormented by the belief that they had committed wrongs they had not actually committed. Church records from Europe in the 14th and 15th centuries contain descriptions that, when read today, carry the unmistakable structure of OCD. The thought arrives. The person tries to neutralize it. The relief does not last. Based on what historians have documented about public figures of that era, some scholars have speculated that Martin Luther's well-documented episodes of spiritual anguish, his relentless self-examination, his inability to feel absolved no matter how many times he confessed, may reflect a form of scrupulosity-type OCD. To be clear, this is a historical interpretation, not a diagnosis, and Luther himself lacked the framework to understand his own experience in clinical terms. But it offers a window into how OCD, unnamed and misunderstood, was shaped by the cultural and religious context it inhabited. It likely shaped him back. The first modern clinical account came in the late 19th century from the French neurologist and psychologist Pierre Janet, who documented cases through his extensive clinical work in Paris during the 1880s and 1890s. Janet used the term psychasthenia and described patients who were consumed by doubt, compelled to perform rituals, and yet deeply aware that their behaviors were irrational, unable to stop despite that awareness. Janet's crucial observation: insight does not equal control. You can know something is irrational and still be completely powerless against it. This remains one of the most important and most misunderstood features of OCD today. Sigmund Freud also wrote extensively about obsessional neurosis. His 1909 case study of Ernst Lonzer, known in the literature as the Rat Man, documented a patient tormented by obsessive fears involving rats and harm befalling people he loved. Freud's psychoanalytic interpretation has been largely superseded by subsequent science, but the case remains a striking record of genuine suffering, and it helped establish obsessional symptoms as a serious psychological phenomenon, deserving clinical attention rather than moral judgment. The real turning point came in 1966, when British psychologist Victor Meyer, not a psychiatrist, as is sometimes incorrectly assumed, but a clinical psychologist and the most respected behavior therapy trainer in the UK at the time, treated 2 patients at the Middlesex Hospital in London using a technique that would later be named Exposure and Response Prevention, or ERP. Meyer's approach, described in his landmark paper, Modification of Expectations in Cases with Obsessional Rituals, was simple in principle. Expose the patient to what triggered their obsession and prevent the compulsion. Both patients had previously failed extensive treatment. One had undergone years of psychoanalysis and even neurosurgery. After weeks of Meyer's new approach, both regained functional lives. Stanley Rockman, who would go on to become one of the most important OCD researchers in the world, later described Meyer's work as breaking the ice, because until Meyer, OCD was widely considered nearly impossible to treat. One of the most significant shifts in OCD research over the past 4 decades has been the development of neuroimaging tools that allow researchers to examine the functioning brain directly. What they found transformed how the disorder is understood. The most consistently replicated neurological finding in OCD involves a circuit called the cortico-striato-thalamocortical loop, or the CSTC circuit. This circuit connects the prefrontal cortex, the caudate nucleus within a region called the striatum, and the thalamus, forming a signaling loop that helps regulate the initiation and stopping of thoughts and behaviors. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, psychiatrist Louis Baxter and his colleagues at UCLA published landmark neuroimaging studies using positron emission tomography, PET scans, showing that people with OCD had measurably elevated activity in the orbitofrontal cortex and the caudate nucleus compared to people without OCD. The orbitofrontal cortex is involved in detecting threats and generating signals that something is wrong. The caudate nucleus acts, under normal circumstances, like a release valve. It signals when a behavior or thought is complete, so that the brain can shift its attention to something else. In OCD, this release valve appears to be dysregulated. The alarm fires. The behavior is performed. But the signal that says it's done, you can move on, does not arrive clearly enough. So the brain keeps sounding the alarm. Baxter's team also found something remarkable. After successful psychological treatment, those patterns in the brain changed. The hyperactivity in the orbitofrontal cortex reduced. The brain, it turns out, can be measurably altered by therapy, not just by medication, but by the act of changing behavior. The implications of this finding are still reverberating through the field. Neurochemically, OCD has been most consistently associated with the serotonin system, which is why selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, or SSRIs, are first-line pharmacological treatment. More recent research has also implicated the glutamate system, which governs excitatory signaling, and researchers are actively investigating glutamate-modulating compounds as potential additions to treatment for cases where SSRIs alone are insufficient. Genetics plays a clear role as well. Twin studies have consistently estimated the heritability of OCD at approximately 45 to 65% in adult samples, rising even higher in childhood-onset cases. This is not a single gene, but a polygenic architecture. Many genes in combination with environmental factors that can shape how the brain's alarm systems develop and function. In other words, if you have OCD, it is not because something went wrong with you. it is because you were born with a brain that developed, for reasons not fully within anyone's control, a particular pattern. Understanding this does not make OCD easier, but it does, quietly and importantly, separate the condition from any question of character. Here's the twist that surprises most people when they learn it. The image of OCD that lives in the cultural imagination, the person washing their hands, checking the lock, is only one version of a condition that wears dozens of faces. And for the many people whose OCD looks nothing like that image, the mismatch is not just inconvenient. It is the reason they go undiagnosed for a decade. Contamination OCD is the subtype most visible in popular media. Fears of germs, illness, toxins, or a more abstract sense of impurity, accompanied by compulsions like excessive washing, cleaning, or avoidance of perceived contaminants. But even within this category, the experience can diverge sharply from the stereotype. Some people fear spreading contamination to others more than contracting it themselves, driven less by self-preservation than by moral terror. Harm OCD involves intrusive thoughts or images about harming oneself or others. Most, distressingly, people the person loves completely. These thoughts arrive against the person's will, and they cause intense distress because they contradict everything the person values. This is essential to understand. The presence of profound distress about the thought is itself evidence that the thought is unwanted. But the shame and the fear of what the thought might mean can prevent someone from ever mentioning it to another person, sometimes for the entirety of their life. Pure O, short for purely obsessional, describes OCD in which the compulsions are almost entirely mental rather than physical. There is no visible ritual. The rituals happen inside. Mental review, internal argumentation, silent reassurance seeking, endless analysis. Because nothing external is happening, pure O is especially likely to go unrecognized, and the person experiencing it is especially likely to believe they are simply going mad in some private and singular way. Scrupulosity, with its centuries of history, involves tormenting doubt about morality, ethics, or religious observance. Did I sin without realizing it? Am I fundamentally a bad person? Did I say something that offended God? The structure is the same, OCD cycle, but the content is filtered through the specific lens of the person's moral or spiritual context. Relationship, OCD or ROCD, is a presentation many people encounter without ever having a name for it. The person becomes consumed by doubt about their relationship. Do I truly love my partner? Is this the right person? Are my feelings real? The doubts are persistent, return immediately after temporary reassurance, and cannot be resolved by logic. Because OCD does not respond to evidence. This is what distinguishes ROCD from ordinary relationship uncertainty. Symmetry and just right OCD involves an urgent, aversive need for things to feel balanced, complete, or correct. Often described not as a fear of catastrophe, but as an unbearable internal sensation that something is simply off. Researchers sometimes call this a not just right experience, and there is evidence it may involve slightly different neurobiological mechanisms from the purely anxiety-driven forms. All of these faces. One underlying structure, an unwanted thought, a spike of distress, a ritual, temporary relief, and the thought waiting on the other side. Understanding the clinical picture of OCD is one thing. Understanding what it actually costs a person to live inside it is something quieter and more difficult to convey through a list of diagnostic criteria. People with OCD frequently describe their condition as exhausting in a way that language barely reaches, not just emotionally, but cognitively and physically. Every day involves a kind of sustained vigilance, monitoring thoughts, responding to alarms, performing rituals, then carefully concealing all of it from the people around them. the mental labor is immense and entirely invisible from the outside. One of the most painful and least acknowledged features of OCD is the shame that wraps around it, because many obsessions involve themes that are genuinely disturbing. Thoughts about harm, sexuality, contamination, moral failure. People with OCD frequently interpret those thoughts as revealing something true and terrible about themselves. They become, in effect, the prosecutor of their own character. And because they are ashamed of what the thoughts seem to mean, they go silent. They don't tell a partner. They don't tell a friend. They don't tell a therapist. Some people carry the full weight of their OCD for decades without a single honest conversation about it. Research consistently identifies shame as one of the most significant barriers to help seeking an OCD. A person with intrusive thoughts about harm may genuinely fear that disclosing those thoughts to a mental health professional will result in hospitalization or being reported to authorities or simply being seen as dangerous, none of which reflects how trained OCD specialists actually respond to these disclosures. But the fear is real, and it keeps people silent, and the avoidance that OCD generates can quietly, gradually, shrink a person's life down to the shape of their fear. Someone with contamination. OCD might stop visiting friends' homes, stop using public bathrooms, stop traveling, stop eating food they haven't prepared themselves. Someone with harm OCD might stop holding sharp objects, avoid being alone with people they love, refuse to drive. Each avoidance is maintained by relief, by not having to face the triggering situation. And so it is reinforced in exactly the same way compulsions are reinforced. The OCD expands to fill the space the avoidance creates. The world gets smaller, the fear gets larger, the years pass. This is not a dramatic trajectory. It is a quiet one. It happens incrementally, one avoided situation at a time, one more thing crossed off the list of things that feel safe. And by the time someone reaches a clinician, often more than a decade after symptoms began, the OCD has had years to build architecture inside their life that now requires careful, sustained work to dismantle. Understanding this is not meant to be discouraging. It is meant to be honest. Because the same commitment that OCD demands in maintaining its hold can be redirected with the right support toward recovery. The persistence required to live inside OCD for years is evidence of the same strength that treatment calls on. The person has been fighting something genuinely difficult, alone, without a map. That is not a small thing. Now we arrive at the part of the story that completely reframes everything that came before it. In 1978, British psychologist Stanley Rachman and his colleague Padmal de Silva, working at the Institute of Psychiatry in London, published a study titled Abnormal and Normal Obsessions. They gave questionnaires about intrusive thoughts to 124 non-clinical participants, people with no known mental health condition. What they found was that approximately 80% of those participants reported having intrusive thoughts that were, in terms of content, nearly identical to clinical obsessions. Thoughts about harm, contamination, sexuality, morality, and doubt. 80%. The obsessive thought, the content itself, was not a clinical abnormality. It was a feature of normal human cognition. What distinguished people with OCD was not the arrival of the thought. It was what happened in the moment after. The appraisal, the interpretation, the meaning assigned. This insight became the foundation for cognitive models of OCD, most influentially developed by British psychologist Paul Salkowskis at the Institute of Psychiatry at King's College London, beginning with a landmark paper in 1985. Salkowskis proposed that the key mechanism in OCD is inflated, responsibility asterisk, the interpretation that having a disturbing thought makes the person morally responsible for preventing the harm it depicts. If I thought about hurting someone and something happens to them, it must be connected to my thought. Or, thinking about something terrible makes it more likely to happen. Or, a good person would not have this thought. Therefore, the thought reveals something true and dangerous about me. These appraisals, not the thoughts themselves, are what transform a normal intrusion into a clinical obsession. And here's the cruelest part of the whole system. In the 1980s, psychologist Daniel Wegner at Harvard conducted a series of experiments on thought suppression that became known in the research world as the white bear studies. Participants were told not to think about a white bear. Not only were they unable to comply, they thought about white bears more frequently than participants who had been given no such instruction. The attempt to suppress the thought made it more mentally accessible, not less. In OCD, this dynamic causes devastating reinforcement. An intrusive thought arrives. The person is alarmed. They try to push it away. It returns more forcefully. They perform a compulsion to neutralize the distress. Temporary relief. And then the thought, having now been treated as a serious threat by every part of this response, comes back. More urgent, more credible, more insistent than before. The compulsion is not a solution. It is fuel. And perhaps the most important, most liberating insight in all of OCD science. None of this, not the thought, not the alarm, not the compulsion, is the person's fault. It is not a failure of character or of willpower. It is a failure of strategy. And that distinction between the person and the pattern is where treatment begins. There is real and meaningful hope in the treatment of OCD. The evidence base is robust. Outcomes are substantial. Recovery is not always the elimination of every intrusive thought, but it frequently means a life no longer organized around them. Exposure and response. Prevention, or ERP, is the gold standard psychological treatment. Victor Meyer pioneered the idea in 1966, and it was Edna Foa and her colleagues at the University of Pennsylvania who systematically developed, tested, and disseminated it across decades of research. The principle is that the person is gradually exposed to the situations or thoughts that trigger their obsessions, while refraining from the compulsion that would normally follow. Through this process, the brain learns that the feared outcome does not occur, and that the anxiety generated by the obsession will naturally diminish without the compulsion. Modern understanding frames this as inhibitory learning, not habituation, but the development of a new and competing memory. You survive the obsession without the ritual. Your brain can now hold both possibilities. ERP is not comfortable, but it is conducted carefully, collaboratively, and at a pace determined by the person going through it. Response rates hover around 60 to 80% in well-controlled trials, making it one of the most effective psychological treatments for any anxiety spectrum condition in existence. Cognitive approaches integrated with ERP work directly on the appraisals Tsiolkovsky's identified: the inflated responsibility beliefs, the thought-action fusion, the catastrophic significance assigned to intrusive thoughts. By changing how thoughts are interpreted, cognitive work reduces the distress that drives compulsive responding. SSRIs, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, are the first-line pharmacological treatment supported by decades of controlled trials. Medications including fluvoxamine, fluoxetine, sertraline, and paroxetine have all demonstrated significant efficacy. Notably, OCD often requires higher SSRI doses than are used for depression, and full response can take 10 to 12 weeks, longer than most people expect. The YBOCS, the Yale-Brown Obsessive Compulsive Scale, developed in 1989 by Wayne Goodman, Lawrence Price, Stephen Rasmussen, Carolyn Mazur, and their colleagues, became the field's standard tool for measuring symptom severity, and its existence made rigorous, comparable research trials possible for the first time. By providing a consistent, reliable metric, the Y-box allowed researchers to actually measure whether treatments were working, and to compare results across clinics, countries, and decades. Acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT, offers a complementary approach, helping people change not the content of their thoughts, but their relationship to those thoughts. Rather than fighting obsessions, ACT guides people toward holding them with a kind of open, non-reactive awareness, while continuing to act in accordance with their values. For some people, this provides a pathway when traditional ERP has been difficult to access or sustain. There is a word that comes up again and again in accounts from people who have recovered from OCD. It is not the word you might expect. It is not cured. It is not fixed. It is freedom. Freedom from organizing the entire day around avoidance. Freedom from the hours surrendered to rituals. Freedom from the secret that consumes so much energy to maintain. Freedom to engage with ordinary uncertainty, the kind that is simply part of being alive, without needing to resolve it first. Here is the reveal that reframes everything. The path out of OCD does not involve eliminating intrusive thoughts. It involves changing what happens in the moment after they arrive. The thought still comes. What changes is the response to it. And when the response changes, when the compulsion is no longer performed, again and again, in the presence of the thought, the brain gradually, carefully learns to write a different ending. It learns that the thought is not a threat that must be defeated. It is a thought. It passes. This is the lived work of treatment. It is not effortless. It requires sitting with discomfort that is genuine and often intense. But it is also finite. The discomfort peaks and it recedes. Every time the person allows that receding to happen, without the compulsion cutting it short, the loop loses a little of its authority. People who have undergone successful ERP frequently describe a quality to their thinking afterward that they had forgotten was possible, a kind of spaciousness. The mind that had been an echo chamber becomes a room with open windows. Thoughts come in. They move through. They leave. This is not reserved for a few lucky people. It is what the evidence shows, consistently, across decades of trials, across cultures, and age groups and presentations. Recovery from OCD is real. It is meaningful. And it is available. Not to everyone in the same measure or at the same speed, but as a genuine possibility for the vast majority of people who engage with appropriate treatment. One final thing, and this is perhaps the most important of all. OCD attaches itself most ferociously to the things people care about most. Harm. OCD strikes parents who love their children fiercely. Scrupulosity torments people with the deepest moral commitments. Our OCD tortures people who take love seriously. The content of the obsession almost always targets the person's most cherished values, which is why the thought feels so unbearable, and why the shame it generates runs so deep. The shame says, this thought means something about you. The science says, it means nothing except that you are human, and that your brain has developed a particular pattern. These two things, the shame and the science, are in direct and absolute contradiction. And gently, over time, with the right support, the science can win. If something in tonight's exploration felt familiar, if the loop, the doubt, the years of silence resonated somewhere inside you, please know that what you are experiencing has a name, a history, and a path forward. The International OCD Foundation maintains a directory of specialized therapists. The evidence-based treatment database of the Anxiety and Depression Association of America offers another starting point. A conversation with a clinician who specializes in OCD is not a last resort. It is a beginning. The mind that runs in loops is the same mind that fights, that persists, that carries something enormously heavy without anyone knowing. That is not weakness. That is something far closer to its opposite. Let your breath be a little slower now. Let the weight of the evening soften. Whatever you carry into sleep tonight, carry it a little more gently. because now you understand it better than most people ever will. If this quiet time has been valuable to you, I would be so grateful if you shared it with someone who might need it, left a like, and subscribed to Sleepable Psychology. There are many more evenings ahead, and many more rooms inside the mind to explore together, slowly, carefully, and always with kindness. Good night.